On today's episode of Pushback Talks, Frederick and I are going back to the Netherlands, where housing protests have erupted in cities across the country. Housing in the Netherlands is under a lot of pressure. In the last 10 years, they've seen homelessness double, and in the last year, they've seen steep rises in rents, particularly in the city of Rotterdam, the country's second largest city and its poorest. 60% of Rotterdam residents qualify for social rents, but the city government has taken a policy to demolish social housing and to replace it with more expensive units. This has caught the attention of the United Nations, and it's not surprising that tenants are pushing back. Recently, there was a huge protest in Rotterdam with 7,000 people demanding that housing be more affordable and resisting the selling off of social housing, really asking for a different approach, one that recognizes housing as a human right.
I'm Frederick Gerten, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And this is Pushback Talks, and we're going to talk about the Netherlands. We've done it before, but there's been big protests in the streets of Amsterdam. And this weekend, Sunday, there was a big protest in Rotterdam, the second biggest town of the Netherlands. So we have today two guests.
Two for the price of one.
We have Gwen van Eijk, who is an urban sociologist at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And she's been out on the streets this weekend with woonopstand, the housing revolt. So welcome to Pushback Talk, Gwen. How was it on Sunday?
It was great. So many people came out. It was the second protest. The first protest was in September on the 12th. 15,000 people came to Amsterdam. And this was the second protest in Rotterdam. I think somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 people. So that's great. We haven't seen so many people on the streets for this issue in the last years or even decades, I see. There hasn't been a day since, I think 2 months ago, where media hasn't been talking about housing issues. And also I see a shift in the conversation about what housing issues are being talked about. For the financialization, for example, I think that wasn't a mainstream topic. And now it's becoming a mainstream topic to talk about. So, the
stuff we talk about in the film, basically, financialization
exactly,
and
yes.
Housing is a human right. You know, in the end of the film, Leilani is forming a new organization called The Shift. And The Shift she has been growing that for a while since you stopped as a UN Special Rapporteur. And there is now a shift opening up in the Netherlands. And we have here Jan de Vries. You are the founder of Shift the Netherlands and also a leading housing advocate. Welcome to Pushback Talks.
Thank you very much. Yes, I've been involved with the right to housing now for the last 6 years. Also, when it wasn't considered a right yet in Dutch political language. I'm a representative of the Shift, which Leilani, of course, founded when at the end of her rapporteurship, and trying to push at least the human rights language and the content of what it means explicitly to refer to the right to housing and to use it as a basis for housing strategies in the Netherlands. And as such, I've been involved on very much in the background, because the real activists are Gwen and Mustafa and Edwin, all these people who've been working on the woonprotest and woonopstand in the Netherlands. But in the background, I think it's very important for me as an advocate, as a human rights advocate, also to explain in the papers, in the media, to politicians, to activists, that saying something is a right and housing is a right also means something, and what it means is sometimes quite complicated, and it needs to be explained.
I was thinking, as I was getting ready for our podcast today, what's my trajectory with the Netherlands. And first of all, I got my housing start. This is something Frederick doesn't even know. I worked internationally at an organization that doesn't exist anymore called CORE, the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions, which was based in Utrecht. So I've actually been there, and that's where I kind of got my housing start. But when I became rapporteur in 2014, one of the very first communications that I filed, that's like this legal letter that we write to states, was to the government of the Netherlands for their failure to provide emergency housing for refugees and migrants. Cities wanted to, but the national level government wasn't giving money to the municipalities for the municipalities to have spaces. So that was my first. And then Frederick, we had the amazing screening of Push in Amsterdam. What was the name of the theater? This grand...
The Carré Theater, the big circus building in Amsterdam. It was 1,300 people attending, and it was hosted by one of the big newspapers. It was really cool, and and the film has also been on TV several times in the Netherlands. So it's very cool that the film kind of plays a role in the debate, and that it can be used. I mean, the film is nothing without local activists, of course. But I think when your language comes through, it's easier to talk about things. And Gwen, it's obviously that you are actually moving things now. It's a big step, this big protests.
I think so, yes. I think we've started there was already a housing movement in the Netherlands, but now we've started a series of protests in various cities. So various other cities are protesting end of October, and The Hague, big city as well, in November. Groningen, in the north of the Netherlands, end of November. So I think that's looking really hopeful, that other cities are now, other groups are continuing this, and that we are also able to connect more action groups, more local groups, and to make this movement even bigger.
So how was it yesterday? Tell us about how was the day yesterday?
It was great. We invited speakers who are activists themselves. So we wanted to show something of how are people being hit by the housing crisis, but also how to become involved in activism in very different ways.
That's cool, Jan. We talk a lot about that. The housing the financial crisis in 2008 kind of changed many things in the global housing market, but it seemed like also in the Netherlands that it's actually political decisions much later on that even made this problem even worse. So it's this kind of deregulating neoliberal politics have still been modern up to like 5 years ago or something like that.
Absolutely. I look at it purely from a human rights perspective, and that gives me a sort of objective, apolitical view on it. So what I try and do is I try and look at housing from a human rights perspective, and looking at it from a human rights perspective means that you look at the rise of homelessness, you look at marginalized housing, you look at how many people can't pay the rent, you look at all of these elements that are elements of the right to adequate housing. And what really surprises me is that when I started doing this in about 2015, all of the indicators were red, all of them. I mean, more and more people were paying more and more of their income on rents. Energy prices went up. Homelessness skyrocketed, and there was no talk of a housing crisis at all at that moment. So what you see is, looking back at it, what the politicians and the minister were really focusing on were things like housing prices. After 2008, the housing prices dropped. So the top priority for politicians was to get the housing prices up, which was the thing that they steered on, right? A lot of policy decisions can be brought back to those indicators. And they're not human rights indicators. You look at the human rights indicators and you look at the policies that have impacted on those human rights indicators, certainly on homelessness, absolutely. There you see a lot of decisions that are made. If people had the right to housing in mind, they wouldn't have made that decision. With Gwen and with the people from Home Protest, we were invited to the Ministry of Interior, and the minister wanted to talk to us about the protests and listen to our claims. There she also indicated, when I took this portfolio 4 years ago, I couldn't have anticipated that this would be such a big issue now, right? Because the Minister of Housing, which we had a separate minister for, said that, well, housing can be left to the market now. It's finished. It's done. But I thought, well, 4 years back, that's like 2017. And I can recall that homelessness was enormously on the rise. We knew all of these numbers about people not being able to pay their rent. We knew the numbers of evictions, et cetera, et cetera. So the issue wasn't that there wasn't a housing crisis then. The issue was that the indicators they were looking at were not human rights indicators. They weren't steering on, let's realize the right to housing. They were looking at it from a purely economical perspective.
Interesting, Leilani, because 2017 was the year we started to do push. We met. And it's true that the global debate wasn't there. It happened a lot over these 3 years.
I actually saw a video that one of our Pushback Talk supporters put out there, Doris Voss. It was a YouTube video of the Minister of Housing, Stef Blok. And I actually found it was humorous in a way and obviously devastating in another way, because he's speaking to a room of investors. It's all these men in suits, white men in suits. And he's reassuring them about how Netherlands is going to come through and have a better housing system going forward. And he talks specifically about decreasing social housing, removing rent controls, introducing short-term rental platforms in a more enhanced way, and going after pension funds and global investors to really energize the housing system in Netherlands.
Oh, and he got everything. He got everything. That's
recipe,
bingo.
Right?
I mean,
it's
that's
the recipe.
come on, it's cool. I mean, this is the global model, and he could see it.
The global model for the global housing crisis.
How do you destroy people's lives? Well, here's the recipe.
Exactly. I love it.
It's really important to understand that this happened at a moment when the waiting lists for social housing were already enormously high, when people in social housing with low income were already paying 40-50% of their income only on rent.
Crazy.
So there wasn't this idea of thinking of how can we make it more affordable for people with low income, et cetera, et cetera. It was purely financially driven.
This had already started over 30 years ago. This idea of, when neoliberalization basically started in many Western countries. And I think it's interesting that focus of the Ministry of Housing that we once had has shifted to a focus on the housing market. It's about facilitating the housing market and not so much housing for all, let alone affordable housing. As Jan says, I think that's what we as a movement also see as the fundamental problem, that it's not about housing for all.
We had one pushback talks with Frans Timmermans, who is a former Dutch foreign minister, now EU commissioner, vice president of the European Commission. And he basically said it was a great mistake to deregulate the markets like we did. So I guess he is not in power in the Netherlands right now, but can you feel that more and more politicians actually are understanding that we've lost control and we have to kind of rewind in some ways?
Yes and no. I think that the language of housing as a right is being used more, particularly by leftist political parties. But I think the idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with how we approach the housing issue, still feel that is lacking. It's still really about, okay, there's a housing market. Even in our talk with the minister, she said, of course, there's a right to housing. I fully accept that and acknowledge that. But yet she talks only about a housing market. That doesn't connect
so you have
for
to
me.
push it one step further.
So, yes, and even politicians who really say in their political pamphlets, for example, housing is a right. Still, when you look at their ideas, their concrete plans for policy changes, etc., feel they haven't really been looking at what does that mean and what do we need to do. For example, that the problem of unhoused people is not a priority for many political parties. That really says it all.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with Gwen. In the sense that everybody now, every political party, and even I say every political party will say housing is a right. It's fundamental. It's fundamental to be to live, and then indeed they approach it from the current system, which is a market-based system, and then look at the proposals that they have are mostly reacting to excesses of that market, and then trying to put band-aids on that instead of, and that's the step back that we need to make. Instead of really making that shift, and I know that's what Leilani is standing for also, is taking the right to housing as the fundament of your housing strategy, of your vision of housing and how it should be. And then there is a place for the market. I don't think there isn't a blueprint for how to do that, how to fulfill the right to housing, how to respect and protect the right to housing. And the market can absolutely play a role in it. But the way it's now, it's that market is the fundamentals, and then the right to housing is used as a band-aid, and it should be, the shift should be that the right to housing is the fundament, and then is the basis, and then the market can help to fulfill the right to housing. And every time you look at these solutions that come from political parties, it should be looked at from how is this going to fulfill the right to housing for all, and that's really important also with the movement and with the protest, with a priority to housing the homeless and the people who are now in marginalized housing.
Well, just first to say that I really liked the way Jan articulated that. I think you've said it better than I've said it previously, to be honest, which is we do need governments to lead with human rights. Right now, governments cower and are in the hands of investors and corporate actors and landlords and developers, the whole industry. So they allow that industry, including the financialized end of that industry, to lead, to lead, really, as Gwen said, it is how they move forward their housing market and markets. And there has to be that fundamental shift to saying, well, we as government have belief and understanding and obligations that housing is a human right, and we're going to lead with that. But that requires governments to really step forward and step up, because they are the ones with the obligations, and they are going to have to show the sector how to engage housing in a way that moves forward the human right to housing. And that means looking at things like profitability totally differently. As Jan said, it doesn't mean there's no role for the private market. It's a different role, and it's one that they don't get to lead. They're following.
But Leilani, is there a role for this financialized finance world?
I keep getting asked that.
I mean, into the Netherlands, it's flooding in a lot of money and it all gets parked into, real estate, as they call it. And this happens everywhere. And it destroys the market.
There isn't a role for it in its current dominance in the way that it is running now. I have heard of some funds for the development of housing that are different, that are more in keeping with a human rights approach, even real estate investment trusts for social good. But in their current form, Blackstone, private equity, BlackRock, no, there isn't. I don't think it can continue. I think it has to stop.
So how can you stop? Because I know that Blackstone is also investing a lot into the Netherlands. How can you how can you make your country less attractive? I know Denmark have a legislation. The Germans tried; it got stopped in the constitutional court, but I guess they will try again. But so, what can you do in the Netherlands to keep them out?
I think a lot of our demands of the current movement are to turn things back, to change the situation to what it was a couple of years ago. For example, rent controls, rent protection. As Leilani talked about, former Minister Stef Blok really saw that as an opportunity for investors to minimize rent protection. So that now we have an evaluation of 5 years of less control and protection, and we're seeing the devastating impact of that on people paying too much rent, having to move every 2 years, which wasn't the case before. One of our other demands is more investment by the government in social housing, and also not limiting access to social housing to the lowest income groups. Because a lot of people who are above that income thresholds, they're really having trouble paying rent when you're on the free market of rental housing. Or, a lot of these people are not able to have a mortgage. So the government needs to step in also for these groups. And this is something that's been deliberate policy over 30 years to minimize the social housing sector. So we need more investment to have affordable housing for the lowest income groups, but also the lower middle income groups, if you will. And I think that's a message that hasn't really arrived yet in our former... the political parties are now negotiating for a new government, because we have had elections,
a year ago it seems.
ago already, but yes.
They're still negotiating?
But still they're negotiating which coalition should lead the country. And unfortunately it seems like it's going to be the same coalition. So I don't think there's going to be much change. So we need to also mobilize people to protest more locally.
Jan, can I ask, as a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, you used to work at the National Human Rights Institution. Do you think that there's any scope, room for legislative change? Is that something that you're thinking about in the Netherlands context?
A lot of potential in terms of legislative change is on the minor things. So it's what Gwen also indicated. It's about creating room for municipalities to have this. When you buy a house, you have a duty to live in it yourself, which is a sort of a way to ban investors, basically. So there are a few things that you could do in terms of legislation. I think there certainly is a number of things you could do in terms of legislation to enhance tenant protection, to enhance also participation of tenants in shaping policies at a local level. But it's a complicated system because in the sense that you can centralize some of the stuff in terms of policies and legislation, but there is also a lot of room for municipalities to decide themselves.
So maybe every city, every municipality needs its own human rights-based strategy, is what you're saying.
Well, for me, I think human rights, in that sense, are really, really interesting in a decentralized country like the Netherlands, because whatever way you look at it, the state is responsible. The state has duties, right? So the human rights framework provides a framework for the states in which they can enact legislation, policies, strategies, etc., etc. And all of those state actors need to abide by it, municipalities and national government. And what I see, for example, in a homelessness discussion, is that one of the key indicators for fulfillment of the right to housing is, of course, the rise in number of homeless people. And what has happened in the Netherlands is that they decentralized the whole homelessness policies. So they decentralized it from national government to the municipalities. And at a certain point, where before it was nationally the homeless people were counted, municipalities were now made responsible for it. So some municipalities weren't counting, others are counting, but only counting a certain amount of categories. Everybody's using a different definition, etc., etc. Lots of frustration, right? So now, when we have a Secretary of State who's responsible for homelessness, who is at the Ministry of Health, by the way, not the ministry responsible for housing, but anyway, he has indicated, I have this action plan, and it's based on housing for homeless people. And of course, when you have this policy, you want to understand the effects of this policy, right? So first of all, you need to create a baseline. You need to understand, okay, how many homeless people do we have in the Netherlands, right? So let's ask the municipalities how many homeless people. And we're one year into this policy, and it's going to end also in very soon. But we're 1 year into this policy, and nobody knows how many homeless people there are in the Netherlands. I mean, Statistics Netherlands comes up with a figure like 36 or 38,000, but it's not a really interesting data. What you really want to know is really how do you count the homeless and how many people are there in order to assess the effect of your policy. Now,
and how many people are under stress of not being able to pay the rent? I mean,
exactly.
That also goes for journalists or architects or painters,
absolutely,
or whoever
absolutely.
you are, taxi drivers or nurses or policemen. It's a whole society. I mean, I can hear that Amsterdam has a problem getting teachers because the teachers can't afford to live in Amsterdam anymore.
Yeah, but then just to finish that homelessness story, of course, the central government is really not so keen on telling municipalities what to do, and the municipalities don't really like to get orders from the national government because they have this freedom of making the policies themselves. But now you can use, of course, the human rights framework to say, well, the national government can say, well, we need to understand how many homeless people there are because it's an essential indicator for the right to housing. So if we get questions from the UN or from the European Committee on Social Rights, we need to tell them something. And that really is a way also for the national government to keep, to at least provide a framework for these municipalities to work in, and not to allow them all sorts of freedoms to do whatever they like within whatever limits they like. So I think the human rights framework in a decentralized setting like that really, really works well also.
We're soon wrapping up here, but what you're doing in the Netherlands now with the protest is big. What you've had this weekend in Rotterdam and what you had in Amsterdam the week before. This is, you were all listening to each other. So what do you think is the message to other activists in other countries from the Netherlands? What are you bringing in for inspiration? You can also answer that, Leilani. What do you see coming? Because I think this is. Are you doing it in a way that could also inspire others? How do you see it, Gwen?
I think it's important that we first have a broad conversation about this in the Netherlands, because I feel that there hasn't been a real understanding of all the issues. So I feel that we're really at the beginning of this movement.
That's an important step.
And even though I know that many, this is not, I mean that there are many action groups have been fighting for the right to housing for years. But I think until recently, it's been seen as an issue of, well, some marginalized groups are being hit by this housing, but it's not really a housing crisis that affects so many people. And only recently, I think that's become the main, the dominant view. This is really now even people who are have a higher education.
Yeah, that's why I said it, because if we only talk about the homeless, which is of course really important, we kind of, it's not for all to talk about. I think it's important that we understand that this is something that affects almost everyone. There is, I mean,
yes,
Occupy Wall Street
some
created
groups.
this 1%, so they do better. Of course,
Yeah.
that might be 30% who are not suffering, but I mean, even the people with money, their kids are suffering. You know, so it creates a total stress, and then your local coffee shop, and then the cinema who can't pay the rent any longer. I mean, it destroys communities, destroys the cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but this has been going on for a while. For example, I'm also involved in the Rotterdam action group, Right to the City. We started this because we were very unhappy with the gentrification policies who really displace lower income groups. So we started just before, I think, the conversation really started in the Netherlands more broadly. And I think on one hand it's unfortunate that it only becomes this huge topic when the middle classes are being hit, and on the other hand, yeah, that's the way it works apparently.
Well, and use the power of the middle class to change things. I mean, I think that's why Berlin is actually shaking things now. I mean, what to say?
Yeah, well, we need to continue to talk about all the different groups that are being hit, and not leave the most marginalized groups who've being hit and have been vulnerable for years already, leave them behind once the problems are solved for the higher income groups. So I think that's really a challenge that we can already think about how to handle this and how to continue, how to take this forward.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with Gwen. I think we need to be really, really aware and very conscious of the fact that indeed now the middle class is being hit. The conversation starts shifting in the Netherlands, and it becomes it only became a housing crisis when also the middle class was hit. But I think there again, and I'm really ferocious about this human rights framework, but looking at it from a right to housing, we need to continue looking at it, and we need to, start maybe looking at it from a right to housing perspective, because if we are not careful, then the solutions that are going to be brought to the table are solutions only for those middle class people. And even though they are affected highly by the housing crisis, and increasingly looking at it from a human dignity perspective, it is the people who are in marginalized housing, who are in unsafe conditions, who are homeless and houseless. They are discriminated against and don't even have access to housing. Those people whose human dignity is most affected at this moment by the housing crisis. And so solutions from a human rights perspective should focus on their situation as a top priority.
I'm a filmmaker, and I mean, I knew if I should be successful with a film, it needed to hit everybody in the audience in the stomach, meaning also the middle class. And I actually believe that change comes with a lot of people in society moving in solidarity, of course, with the most vulnerable. But I think if we only talk about the homeless, we lose the power of change, which I think you have in your hands. If you have 10,000 out on the streets of Rotterdam and more in Amsterdam, something is happening. And this is also, I think, the Berlin story, where over 1 million voted for socializing housing. It's a big thing. I would say that it is good for everyone, including the homeless. But of course, I understand that it's easy to forget about the most.
Well, I think that's one lesson from the movement, and I look at it from a certain distance. So Gwen can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a very diverse movement. And where all of these organizations were first focusing on specific issues, specific groups in specific municipalities, they all came together now, and it's become a very diverse movement. And you look at what happened yesterday in Rotterdam. 10,000 people. It's a very, very diverse group. Young people, families, old people, people with disability, people of color, everybody was there. And everybody was there because they are affected somehow by this housing crisis. And I think that indeed, that diversity is crucial to build a movement. So fully agree with you, Frederick, that you need...
Thank you. I need people to agree with me. Otherwise I will cry myself to sleep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Leilani,
well,
give me some comfort.
If what we're talking about is really fundamentally changing an existing, very entrenched, very powerful system that has captured government, then we need everyone in. And we need our the middle class folks who are suffering, because though they're suffering, they're also, many of them are still at least housed, and they then have better capacity sometimes to rail and advocate, etc., because they have more resources to support them. And so it's an all-in situation at this point. I mean, it would be like saying, oh, you know, only some people should be rallying against climate change. No, it's an all-in situation for sure. But I take Jan's point that when it comes to then solving the crisis, it's very easy to go to the middle class for governments, because that's where they will get economic growth. They can figure out ways to extend mortgages to young families, and mortgages are about economic growth. Whereas providing social housing and deeply affordable housing can lead to economic growth. It's just a different kind of economic growth. It's over a longer period of time. It's economic growth by supporting people who are disadvantaged so that they can contribute to the economy. So it's having to switch notions of what is economic growth, what is growth for a country. So all in, but focused policies.
Yeah. But it's also about understanding
that
poverty is expensive for a society.
Precisely.
Poverty has a very high price. And I mean, I can see it here in my own town, Malmö, Sweden, where people are not sleeping in the streets, but the city bill for homeless is growing a lot. So the city has to pay more because of these financial institutions entering into the housing market, pushing up the rents. And then the city has to pay more rents for the people who are being kicked out of the market. So I think also the cities need to fight the financialization, because it's
making them poorer.
It's destroying also their economy.
Frederick, I think we're at time.
Yes. So we've been talking a long time, and we love to talk, don't we?
Yes. Yeah.
I could go on.
We can go on. So. But Gwen, I wish you and your friends in Woonopstand and Woonprotest,
Woonopstand and Woonprotest, and all the other movements that are.
I wish you good luck. Keep us posted over Twitter. That's like where we most of the time are, so we can follow and retweet your work. Sometimes also in English, it's a little bit better, because our Dutch is rusty.
Yeah. I will. Well, there's a translate function. But we will.
Jan, good luck with the shift, the Netherlands, and your work, and don't let the minister get away with just saying he understands and not acting. It's not enough. Yeah, and Leilani, we will soon talk again. We have to talk about how we fund this podcast. I know it's a boring point, but it's your job.
My job. I get the boring job of asking for money. We have a Patreon account which you can access anywhere where you download our podcast, and you just click on that link, and then you look up Pushback Talks, and then you give generously, or just a euro a month. Yeah, we love friends.
€1 a month is also nice. So it gives us some kind of energy. It's actually hard to be sustainable as doing this, because I have to work on a new film project, nothing to do with this, and you do your work. So this is like on top of everything. So it is a bit stressful not having money. But anyway, we love to meet cool and active people. So that's also we also get energy back by doing the podcast. So thank you very much. And Gwen, Jan, Leilani, see you soon out there, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frederick.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To watch Push, visit pushthefilm.com. You can also support us by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.